My brother Lucas tore open Grandpa's inheritance papers like they were junk mail. He did it right there, in the middle of the living room with all of us watching. "It's mine now," he said, smirking at the room. My parents exchanged that look, the one they get when they know something is wrong but won't say it out loud. My stomach dropped. My cousins laughed like it was a joke. I sat frozen at the dining table, my hands clenched so hard my nails cut into my palms. No one stopped him. No one said a word. My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept my face blank. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. I locked eyes with his smug grin and realized something in that moment. This wasn't just theft. This was a declaration. He was telling everyone in this room that he could take what was mine and face no consequences. He was telling them I didn't matter. The papers scattered across the floor like confetti at a celebration I hadn't been invited to. My grandfather's signature was visible on them. His careful handwriting that I'd seen 1,000 times on birthday cards and letters. Lucas had the audacity to laugh, a cruel, triumphant laugh that made my skin crawl. My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she said nothing. My father stared at his hands like they belonged to a stranger. As the laughter echoed around me, I made a silent promise to myself. I would remember this moment. I would remember every detail, every word, every expression, and I would spend as long as it took to prove that quiet people never forget. My grandfather had raised me to be strong. He had told me that patience is a weapon. I was about to prove him right. I locked myself in my room that night, and the house felt different around me. The laughter from downstairs had finally stopped, but it still echoed in my ears. I replayed every second. Lucas's confident voice, my father's silence, my mother's uncomfortable glance away. I grabbed a notebook, something I'd never done before, and started writing. Words. The exact tone of his voice. The way my parents hadn't defended me. Every small moment became a note in a song I was learning to understand. My hands shook as I wrote, and I realized something that steadied me. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a choice. It was strategy. If Lucas thought I was broken, he would be careless. If my family thought I'd accepted this, they would lower their guard. The house started to feel like a chessboard where every person was a piece, and I was finally learning how to see the board. I heard Lucas laughing in the hallway outside my door, completely oblivious that I was already watching, already planning my next move. I thought about all the times I'd been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. All those moments had been preparing me for this. Every quiet observation I'd ever made, every pattern I'd noticed, every social dynamic I'd understood, they all became tools. I wasn't just documenting Lucas's betrayal. I was learning to trust my instincts. I was learning that being overlooked was actually a superpower. People tell their deepest secrets when they think no one important is listening. People make their biggest mistakes when they believe they're unobserved. My silence had already begun its work. I started moving through the house differently over the next few days. I'd sit in the living room while Lucas talked to our cousins, pretending to scroll on my phone but listening to every word. He was boasting about his clever move, how he'd outsmarted everyone. I took mental notes of everything. The favoritism became obvious. How my parents had always given him slightly more attention, slightly more money, slightly more belief in his abilities. The old grudges made sense now too. I noticed how he'd manipulated the family dynamics to make people doubt whether Grandpa would have wanted me to have anything at all. One afternoon, while Lucas was out, I opened the drawer where my parents kept old legal documents. My hands trembled as I looked through them. Hidden papers. Forgotten letters. Documents that told a different story than the one Lucas had created. I found an old envelope near the back, dusty and sealed. My grandfather's handwriting was on the front. When I opened it carefully, I saw another version of the will, the real one, dated years before the papers Lucas had stolen. My heart started to race. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about proving the truth. I spent the next 2 weeks in plain sight, watching everything. I'd sit in the kitchen while Lucas bragged to friends about his inheritance. I'd be in the living room when he told cousins how easy it had been. He had no idea I was cataloging every word, every inconsistency, every arrogant claim. My parents moved around me like I was a ghost, and I realized their silence said everything. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't want to deal with it. That was useful information. My brother's confidence was growing by the day. He was already talking about what he'd do with the money, making plans like the inheritance was completely his to use. He'd left bank statements on the kitchen counter once, and I photographed them with my phone. Not secretly, just matter-of-factly, like I had every right to know what was happening to our grandfather's money. 'Cause I did. I had a legal right to know. My brother left a stack of signed papers unattended on the coffee table one evening, and I photographed those too. Everything I was doing was legitimate. Everything was within my rights. But Lucas didn't know that I was building something. He thought I was just broken and quiet. I made an appointment with a lawyer named Mr. Harrison the next week. I told my parents I was going to a friend's house. The office was quiet and professional, and Mr. Harrison listened to my entire story without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked me a simple question. "Do you have any documentation?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken. The bank statements, papers, the envelope with Grandpa's original will. His expression changed. "This is significant," he said. "We need to move carefully, but we have grounds for a legal challenge." He explained what I could and couldn't do. I could request official copies of documents. I could ask the bank for inheritance records. I had a right to those as a potential heir. I could consult with other family members. Everything legal. Everything protected. For the first time since Lucas had stolen those papers, I felt something other than despair. Felt power. Mr. Harrison told me to keep documenting everything I witnessed, to be specific about dates and conversations, and to avoid confrontation until we had a complete picture. I left his office with a legal pad and a plan. I stopped attending family dinners unless it was absolutely necessary. My absence was noticeable. I could see it in the way my mother's jaw tightened when I declined invitations. I could hear the whispers. "Where's she been? I think she's upset. Maybe she's accepting it now." Let them wonder. Let them think I was falling apart at home. The truth was completely different. I was gathering information. I was requesting official documents from the bank. I was consulting with Mr. Harrison twice a week. I was building a case that couldn't be dismissed as emotion or spite. My silence created space for people to get comfortable with a lie. When Lucas saw me at a cousin's birthday party, he actually looked uncomfortable. He'd expected me to be angry or broken. Instead, I was calm. I even smiled at him. His confidence faltered for just a second, and I saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty. That was the moment I knew my strategy was working. Presence could be a weapon. Absence could be a weapon. Silence could be a weapon. Everything was a tool if you knew how to use it. Lucas tried to provoke me at a family lunch. He made a comment about how some people just don't have the strength to compete in the real world. He was looking right at me. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father pretended he hadn't heard. I set down my fork, made eye contact with Lucas, and smiled. Not a fake smile. Real one. And I said, "That's interesting. You must have a lot on your mind." He got angry. He tried to push further, saying things about how I'd always been weak, and how Grandpa probably knew I couldn't handle responsibility. I nodded calmly and asked him to pass the salt. His face turned red. He stood up and left the table. My mother looked at me with something like shock, like she'd expected me to crumble and I hadn't. That was the moment she started to wonder if maybe she'd been wrong about me. That was the moment cracks appeared in her certainty that Lucas deserved the inheritance. My lawyer had told me that confrontation would come, but on my terms, not his. This was just the beginning. I started having careful conversations with cousins I trusted. With my aunt. With my grandmother. I didn't accuse anyone or demand anything. I just asked questions. Do you remember what Grandpa said about the inheritance? Has Lucas ever seemed stressed about money? Do you think he was close to Grandpa? People started opening up. My cousin Ella told me she'd heard Lucas and my father arguing about money years ago. My aunt mentioned that Grandpa had changed his will multiple times over the years. My grandmother said something that made my blood run cold. Your grandfather told me he was worried about Lucas spending money too fast. He wanted to make sure you had security. These weren't accusations. These were just family members sharing what they knew. I documented everything in my notebook with dates and context. Mr. Harrison reviewed my notes and said they could be important corroborating testimony. You're not the only person who sees the inconsistencies, he told me. That matters. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this. I had people who cared about the truth. And Lucas had no idea how many people were starting to question his story. Mr. Harrison met me at the bank with official paperwork. We had a legal right to examine the inheritance records. What we found was stunning. The official will on file was different from the version Lucas had presented. There were dates that didn't match. There were signatures that looked irregular. The bank officer, a woman named Ms. Chen, reviewed the documents with us and said, "This is unusual. We typically maintain detailed records of all inheritance documents. These versions don't align." She pulled the original from the vault, the one that had been filed with the bank decades ago. My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. His original will clearly stated that his estate should be divided equally between Lucas and me. Not all to Lucas. Not even majority to Lucas. Cool. Ms. Chen printed copies for us, and my hands shook as I held them. These papers were everything. They were the truth, documented and filed officially. They were proof that Lucas had lied. They were the foundation of everything we needed. Mr. Harrison looked at me and said, "We have our case. Now we need to present it properly." I thought about Lucas's smug face. I thought about my parents' silence. And I thought about my grandfather, who had wanted fairness for both of us. I started leaving small signs that I knew more than I'd let on. Nothing dramatic. Just subtle things. I'd mention a detail about the inheritance process that I read about. I'd ask Lucas a casual question about something only the guilty would know to answer. His confidence started to crack. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. The way he'd pause before responding to me. The way he'd started checking his phone more frequently, like he was worried about something. One day, I casually mentioned that banks keep very detailed records of inheritance documents. I said it while looking at my phone like I wasn't even talking to him. But I saw his reaction. His face went pale. His shoulders tensed. In that moment, I knew he realized I wasn't the broken sister he'd thought. I was building something. And he was starting to suspect it. Mr. Harrison warned me not to push too hard. We needed him to maintain his confidence, to not hire his own lawyer yet, to not try to cover his tracks more carefully. Let him feel the pressure building, he said. Let him wonder what you know. Fear is often more powerful than facts. Mr. Harrison filed official requests for all inheritance-related documents from the bank. We had every legal right to do this. What the documents revealed was damning. There were transfers that didn't match the original will. There were dates that showed Lucas had accessed accounts before the will was even supposed to be executed. There was a pattern of financial movement that only made sense if someone had been planning to take more than they were entitled to. I made copies of everything and organized it chronologically. I created a timeline of events. I noted every discrepancy. This wasn't guesswork anymore. This was documented fact. Mr. Harrison reviewed everything and said, "This is solid. More than solid. We have evidence of intentional misrepresentation and financial irregularity. We can present this to your parents and suggest a legal resolution, or we can escalate if necessary." I asked him what he recommended. He said, "Let's see if your family will respond to the truth first. Sometimes people just need to see the evidence to do the right thing." I wasn't sure my family would choose that path, but I was willing to find out. Called a family meeting. I told my parents I needed to discuss something important about the inheritance, and that I'd appreciate if they could make time. My mother hesitated. My father was quiet, but they agreed. We sat in the living room on a Saturday afternoon, and I pulled out my copies of the original will. My mother's face went white when she saw them. My father leaned forward. I didn't make accusations. I just presented the documents and asked them to explain the discrepancies. This is the will that was filed with the bank, I said, pointing to one paper. And this is what Lucas presented to everyone. The difference was undeniable. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked away. Where did you get these? My father asked quietly. From the bank, I said. I have every right to request them. The room was silent for a long moment. Then my mother said something that changed everything. I knew something wasn't right. Those 6 words told me everything I needed to know about what she'd suspected all along. I didn't confront Lucas directly. Instead, I let the information circulate through the family. I didn't confront Lucas directly. Instead, I let the information circulate through the family. My parents spoke to my grandmother. My grandmother spoke to my aunt. Whispers started moving through family conversations. I watched Lucas's behavior change. He became agitated. He started making mistakes. At a family dinner, he made a comment about the inheritance that directly contradicted something he'd said weeks earlier. I documented both statements. I just mentioned casually that I remembered him saying something different before. The look on his face was priceless. He realized I'd been listening. He realized I'd been paying attention. He realized I had ammunition. He tried to cover his contradiction with a joke, but everyone at the table had heard it. The tension became unbearable. My cousin pulled out her phone and texted me. What's going on with Lucas? I just responded with a thinking emoji. Let people come to their own conclusions. My cousin Ella called me and asked to meet. We went to coffee, and she told me that Lucas had approached her weeks ago, asking her to confirm that Grandpa had said he wanted Lucas to have most of the inheritance. I told him I never heard Grandpa say that, Ella said. And he got really angry. That's when I knew something was wrong. She offered to sign a written statement about the conversation. Mr. Harrison prepared a simple, factual document that Ella signed. It wasn't a formal legal deposition, but it was her testimony. The same thing happened with my aunt. She admitted that she'd always felt uncomfortable about how quickly Lucas had taken control of the inheritance. She too agreed to provide a written statement. Slowly, quietly, the pieces were assembling. Not through pressure or manipulation, but through people stepping forward with the truth. My grandmother called me and said, I think we need to have a real family meeting about this. Your grandfather would want fairness. For the first time, I wasn't alone. I had people standing with me. Mr. Harrison received documents that showed Lucas had already attempted to transfer additional funds from the inheritance account. The bank had flagged the transaction as irregular because it didn't match the original documentation. The transfer was pending. Lucas had tried to move even more money before anyone had a chance to question what he'd taken. When I learned this, something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't just about greed or entitlement. This was calculated. This was ongoing. This was him trying to take everything before anyone could stop him. I called Mr. Harrison immediately. What does this mean? He asked. He took a deep breath. It means we need to escalate this. We need to file a formal claim with the bank and potentially involve authorities. This is fraud. My quiet, patient strategy had just become urgent. The evidence was overwhelming. Lucas had dug himself into a hole he couldn't escape from. Mr. Harrison filed a formal claim with the bank, requesting that the inheritance accounts be frozen pending resolution of the disputed will. The bank complied. Lucas couldn't move any more money. When he found out, he called my father screaming. I heard him from upstairs. Someone's frozen the account, he shouted. We need a lawyer. My mother came to my room and looked at me with a question in her eyes. I said nothing. She said, "You did this, didn't you?" I said, "I protected what was legally mine. Everything I've done is with my lawyer and within the law." She sat down slowly on my bed. "I should have listened to your grandfather," she whispered. That was the moment my mother's loyalty shifted completely. That was the moment she stopped protecting Lucas and started protecting the truth. I asked if I could speak with my parents alone. We sat in the living room and I told them everything. Not with anger. Not with accusation. Just with facts. I showed them the original will. I showed them the bank documents. I showed them the timeline of Lucas's actions. I told them about the attempted transfer. I looked at my mother and said, "Grandpa trusted us to do what was right. He wanted fairness. I'm asking for fairness." My father had tears in his eyes. "We failed you," he said. "We should have protected you." I didn't need an apology. I needed them to understand. "What I need," I said, "is for you to be honest about what Grandpa wanted. Can you do that?" They both nodded. By the next morning, my parents had hired their own lawyer to work with me and Mr. Harrison. The message was clear. They were no longer on Lucas's side. We scheduled a formal family meeting for 2 weeks later. Mr. Harrison prepared documents. We organized everything chronologically. We made copies of every relevant piece of evidence. We prepared statements from ELLA, my aunt, and my grandmother. Everything was ready. Everything was legal. Everything was irrefutable. The night before the meeting I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Lucas's face when he realized he'd lost. I kept thinking about my parents finally acknowledging the truth. I kept thinking about my grandfather, and what he would think about how this had all unfolded. I'd won this not through manipulation or cruelty, but through patience, truth, and the law. That mattered to me. When morning came I was calm. Whatever happened in that meeting I was prepared. I'd done everything right. The law was on my side. Justice was on my side. Lucas showed up to the meeting with a lawyer of his own, a woman named Ms. Garcia who looked completely unprepared for what was about to happen. We sat in Mr. Harrison's conference room. My parents, my grandmother, Ella, my aunt, Lucas, his lawyer, Mr. Harrison, and me. Mr. Harrison calmly presented the original will filed with the bank. He presented the documents showing the discrepancies. He presented the timeline of Lucas's actions. He presented the statements from family members. With each document, Lucas's face got darker. His lawyer looked shocked. At one point, Lucas tried to interrupt, saying the original will was fake or forged. Mr. Harrison asked him how he thought a document filed with the bank decades ago could be forged by his sister. The question hung in the air. Lucas had no answer. My mother looked at him with profound disappointment. My grandmother looked away, heartbroken. Ms. Garcia asked Lucas directly, "Did you attempt to transfer additional funds from the inheritance account?" Lucas started to answer, then stopped. His lawyer touched his arm. In that silence, everyone knew the truth. Mr. Harrison pulled out the bank records showing the attempted transfer. "According to the bank," he said, "this transaction was flagged as irregular and pending approval. It appears your client was attempting to move funds that were not rightfully his." Lucas stood up. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I don't need to sit here and listen to this." My father stood up too. "Sit down," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Lucas had never heard that tone from our father before. Lucas sat. The rest of the meeting was about the legal resolution. Mr. Harrison explained that the inheritance would be divided equally, as the original will stated. The bank would be instructed to process the funds according to that will. Lucas would need to return funds he'd already taken that exceeded his rightful share. His lawyer started arguing about technicalities, but it was over. Everyone in that room knew it was over. After the meeting, my family stood in the hallway outside the conference room. No one spoke for a long moment. Then my grandmother hugged me. My mother hugged me. Even my father, who rarely showed emotion, held me for a long time. Lucas left without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed him, looking exhausted. Ella squeezed my hand and said, "I'm proud of you." My aunt said, "Your grandfather would be proud too." We stood there together and I felt something shift inside me. The weight I'd been carrying for months finally lifted. It wasn't over. There were still legal details to finalize, but the truth had won. Justice had won. And I had won not by breaking the law, but by respecting it. Not by being cruel, but by being relentless. Not by giving up, but by staying quiet and strong. Over the next 3 weeks, the legal details were finalized. The bank divided the inheritance according to the original will. Lucas was required to return the excess funds he'd taken. His lawyer negotiated a settlement where he paid back most of what he'd taken with interest. He lost the house he'd already purchased with the money. He lost the car. He lost the status he thought he'd gained. More importantly, he lost his place in our family. My parents set a clear boundary. They would support truth and fairness, and they would not support him if he continued to deny his actions. I received my inheritance, half of what Grandpa had intended for me. It wasn't just money. It was validation. It was proof that the quiet, patient path had worked. It was proof that truth matters. And it was proof that I had been right to believe in myself. A month later, I stood in my apartment, a small place I'd put a deposit on with my inheritance. I thought about my brother. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate takes energy, and I'd already spent enough energy on him. I felt something closer to pity. He'd had a choice. Admit what he'd done, make it right, and maybe rebuild some trust. Instead, he'd doubled down on his lies until everything collapsed. That was on him. I thought about my parents, who'd finally chosen honesty over loyalty to their son's version of events. Had been hard for them, but they'd done the right thing. I thought about my grandfather, who'd tried to be fair to both of us even though he'd known Lucas had problems with impulse and greed. Grandpa had been wise. I thought about myself, quiet, observant, patient. I'd turned those qualities into strength. I'd become someone who couldn't be pushed around or lied to or dismissed. That was the real victory. 3 months after the family meeting, Lucas texted me. "We should talk," he said. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop. He looked smaller somehow. Tired. He apologized, but his apology felt rehearsed. He said he'd been struggling with problems I didn't understand. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he hoped someday I could forgive him. I listened to all of it, and when he finished I said, "I forgive you. But forgiveness and trust are different things. You can't rebuild trust with me because we were never really close enough to have trust in the first place. What you did showed me what you're capable of. I don't hate you. I just don't believe you." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just nodded and left. That was the last real conversation we had. Sometimes I'd hear through family members that he was doing okay. He'd moved to a different city. He had a new job. He was trying to rebuild his life. But that was good. I hoped he would actually change. But it didn't matter to me either way anymore. A year after Lucas took those inheritance papers, I sat in my apartment and reflected on everything that had happened. I'd learned that quiet people don't stay quiet because we're weak. Sometimes we stay quiet because we're observing. Sometimes we stay quiet because we're planning. Sometimes we stay quiet because we understand that patience is more powerful than rage. I'd learned that revenge served with patience and truth is not cruel. It's just. I'd learned that the law exists to protect people like me, and I had the courage to use it. I'd learned that my family was flawed, but some of them would ultimately choose what was right. The journey had changed me in ways I never expected. I wasn't the same person who had frozen at that dining table a year ago. I was stronger. I was clearer. I was unafraid. I'd faced my brother's arrogance and didn't blink. I'd confronted my parents' cowardice and didn't back down. I'd built a case that couldn't be broken, and I'd delivered justice without ever compromising my integrity. Most importantly, I'd learned who I was. I was someone who could be wronged and not break. I was someone who could be humiliated and still stand tall. I was someone who could lose and still find a way to win. I looked at myself in the mirror, calm, composed, unshakable, and I smiled. Not from cruelty, from peace. My grandfather's money had given me financial security, but the real inheritance was knowing that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. Quiet people remember everything. And sometimes quiet people win everything. That was my story. That was my truth. And I was finally free.